honestly, it's one of my favourite things about these events is, you know, you meet someone, you have a conversation, and then sometimes things can go in really interesting, useful, innovative ways. So, brilliant. So, welcome back. Hope you've had a good break. In our next session, we've got a fantastic speaker, and then we've got an amazing panel before lunch, so lots to tune into. And we'd like you to start thinking about questions as well. So our next speaker, David Brown from Maersk, is going to take a few questions after his session, and then we've got the panel session as well. So obviously all questions gratefully received. David is the Director of Corporate and Social Affairs for Maersk, the global shipping giant, doing amazing things in the sphere of sustainability. He's worked all over the world, including Egypt, the East Mediterranean, Copenhagen, been to lots of places and seen lots of different things, and is now focusing on sustainability and decarbonisation with net zero firmly in sight. So can we all welcome David Brown from Maersk? Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everybody. I didn't get as good a result as you did in the good morning, but we'll... Good morning, thank you. So, the title of my little talk this morning is Our Journey to Net Zero. Although that's what's printed in the programme, I have updated the title slightly, as it's not Our Journey to Net Zero, but Towards Net Zero, which is about as far as we've got so far. We have actually come a long way, and I'll give you a bit of an insight into that. But also there is a huge way still to go. So we're certainly heading towards net zero. And just to put it in a little bit of perspective, because Maersk is quite a large organisation, quite diverse, I will talk predominantly about the commercial side of our business, and that would be the bit that most people would know or interact with. We do have a separate entity, which is the Maersk Mc-Kinney-Møller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping, and that's a not-for-profit organisation, independent research and development, really working with a whole host of partners and collaborators to get general understanding and acceptance of new technology and innovation. I won't be talking about that. I will be talking more about our commercial side of the business. But happy to take questions on both if there's time towards the end of the session, or I'll be here through the rest of the day. So, our journey towards net zero. With any journey, you need to know where you're going. And to be able to get there, you need to know where you're starting from. So, you know, on my little C chart here, we've got an origin, we've got a destination, we sort of chart a route that we hope to follow, and then we set off on our journey. And along our journey, you have to change course occasionally, take account of how far you've come, and maybe look at where you're headed and if things have changed along the way. And certainly everybody in the maritime industry knows that wind, weather and customs will impact all of these things, so you have to, as soon as you've made a plan, make another plan. So I'm going to sort of take you through where we start from, where we're headed to, how far along we are, the journey, and some of the things that have affected us along that route. So to start on any journey, you've got to know where you're starting from. And I'm going to take us to 2018, which was the point in which we set our destination. So in 2018, we decided we had to do something about the carbon problem, and we set a target of 2050 that we would be zero carbon in our shipping. And I mentioned carbon specifically because in 2018, that was what we were concerned about, or as much as we were aware about in terms of what we were doing. We also set some targets, milestones along the journey to get us to our destination, which was that by 2030, we would have our first green vessel on the high seas. We would have reduced our emissions by 60%, but that was from a 2008 baseline. But at the time that we were setting these, the start of our journey, this was the best information that we had. And so it was good to have something to aim towards. And what we also had on this little table, which may not be visible, and if it's not, then that's quite good, because I can quote the numbers and nobody will be able to say that I'm wrong. But basically what we had at the top half of that chart was the energy that we were burning in terms of fossil fuels, and that was as much of a measure pretty much as we had as the pollution or the emissions that were coming out of those fossil fuels, although there were some measures in greenhouse gases as well. So we had an indication as to where we were starting from, we have an indication as to where we wanted to get to, and we had charted some of the milestones or interim steps that we needed to do to try and get us to a net zero carbon position in 2050. However, the direction was influenced this time not by wind or weather, but by other things, and so we had to do course corrections. Our business started changing really outwardly from about 2019 onwards. We were growing substantially. Along with the ships, which everybody's quite familiar with, we ended up with, between then and now, 450 warehouse sites across the world. We've got 59 of our owned terminals, and we've got joint ventures and where we're majority stakeholders or minority stakeholders around the world as well. That influences what emissions that we're creating. And also, we have our own air fleet now. In fact, we've always had aircraft. Nobody really knew about them, but we're talking about it a bit more. And in terms of air freight movement around the world, we're one of the top 20 air freight movers, and in the UK, one of the top 10 air freight importers. So while we had identified back in 2018 what we wanted to probably try and do about the shipping, our business was changing. We needed to make course corrections, and we needed to understand more about our starting point. Which brings us now slightly more up to date, and with this slide it demonstrates that our vision of where we are, our understanding of how far along our course we have come, has got far, far better. And this is one of the key things about not only knowing where you're coming from and where you're going to, but how far you are in getting there. And the information that we now have in terms of our Scope 1s, Scope 2s, Scope 3 emissions, and where those emissions are happening, and in what quantums, and specifically what chemicals, and what the emissions actually are, will help us in every step to make sure that we're getting it right. So this really gives us, in terms of our navigation of the problem, a real 9-point GPS fix on our position, and allows us to make sure that what we're doing is taking us in the direction that it needs to take us. So we've accelerated our plan. Our goal has changed. From that initial goal, the destination of 2050, having zero carbon, we've now accelerated that timeline, and we're looking at 2040. And we're looking at being net zero, not just in the shipping, but across all the parts of our business. I've got a little slide here that helps me, but I need to take my glasses off to read the slide, and I need them on for my notes, so if I'm doing that back and forward, do excuse me. So as you see, 2018, we launched the ambition. We've now accelerated that, and we are looking at 2030 having a lot more of those milestones really detailed and in place. And not just in terms of the ships, but in actual fact in terms of air, contract logistics, terminals as well. So some of these specifics now are allowing us to drill right into more detail. The ocean freight, we are looking at a 50% reduction in absolute terms, but specifically 25% of all ocean cargo transported with green fuels by 2030. And I'll come back to that because it's really key when we're looking at fuels. Air freight, minimum of 30% of all the air freight, and I've told you how big we're moving in that area, should be moved sustainably by 2030. And all of this will be 100% by the time we get to 2040. So, this improved understanding has allowed us to make sure that the milestones we've got in place are directing the business and getting us to where we really need to get to. And of course, all of it will be net zero by 2040. But how do we get there? The first thing to look at, obviously, is the ships. We've heard this morning that up to 3% of the global greenhouse emissions are created by shipping. In actual fact, when you look at the whole supply chain, it's probably about 11 to 12%, but that's across many, many different modes. But 3% is a big chunk. So the first place we looked is to the shipping. And we heard about a chicken and egg earlier on. This is a slightly different chicken and a slightly different egg. Here we're looking at the fact that we had no fuel providers making fuel because there weren't any ships to burn it. There weren't any ships being built because there wasn't any fuel to be burned. So we just crashed in and did both to break that cycle, to make sure that ultimately something was happening. And this wasn't necessarily to try and be a leader in the industry. It was really just to break the inertia, to try and create some momentum, and not necessarily for the first steps that we got to in terms of sourcing, to make sure that it was our choice that was the choice of all. Not at all. It was really just to try and get some momentum going. So at the point where we ordered the first green methanol container ship back in 2021, there were 5 green ships on order globally. There's now over 200, and over 100 of those are container ships. And so the great thing is, in that 3-year period, we've seen a bit of a break in terms of that inertia, a bit of momentum building, and we hope to see that continuing for a long time to come. So this is a little bit about our order book. The ship that you see on the screen is the feeder vessel, which is only 2,200 TEUs, but it's a more attractive looking vessel than the 16,000 ones which are coming this year. So the vessel that's on the screen, the Laura Maersk, is already in the water, but starting in January we'll see the 16,000 TEU fleet being launched. In fact, the first vessel's in the water and is being fitted out at the shipyard, and we'll have her name giving in January. And we'll continue to see those new buildings come into the fleet during the year and then into the following years as well. These are all dual-fueled on biodiesel and biomethanol, with biomethanol being the main component of the fuel for these ships. The other thing, and we heard it being mentioned earlier on today, is retrofitting. We are starting a retrofitting pilot next year, and that will allow us, if successful, to start retrofitting the existing fleet. So rather than having to just wait for new builds to come on the order book as the older ships are passed out of the fleet, we'll be able to retrofit some of those vessels as well. So new builds is great, new engines are superb, the engine manufacturers are getting very busy, and so far this is all on green methanol. But why is it, before I get to the why of the green methanol, I'll talk about the scale of green fuels that are required. And in this slide, the graphic shows that where we have been in 2022, the world consumption of, it might be just behind the chair there, the world production of green methanol was 100,000 tonnes in 2022. The large column on the far side of the screen, for our fleet, for the target that I showed you a little bit earlier on, which said that we wanted to have 25% of our fleet by 2030 on green fuels, that bar suggests that for us to achieve that in 2030, we need 5 million tonnes. So from 100,000 tonnes today to 5 million tonnes in 2030, and as we heard earlier on, 2030 is just 10 minutes from now. So we really need to get scaling. And the good news is that some of the plans that we're putting in place to help us with our fleet will as well allow methanol for other people's fleets as well. We've made one particular signing recently, an MOU, where that one project will deliver an additional 300,000 tonnes. So one deal that we've just signed up will allow 3 times what has been produced in the world up until now. and we need more and more of those as we move through. And of course, again, I shouted from the floor earlier on, the greenest fuel that we can use is the fuel that we don't actually burn. So efficiencies comes to play overall as well. So I did try and say why green methanol and not something else. We have already heard this morning that there is going to be a need, albeit much smaller, for diesel in the future. Even out to 2050, we'll probably still be needing some diesel for some of the fleet, because the roles that are employed across the industry for vessels are so diverse. For our fleet in the deep sea side of things, we're very fortunate. We can pretty much plan what fuel we need when and where and how much up to a year in advance, because our ships run on a rotation. And apart from capacity and utilisation, things can pretty much be predicted. At the moment, green methanol is available. The technology is available. We've proven that with Laura Maersk, that's already in the water. And it's scalable, albeit it needs a bit of a push, and we want the snowball effect to come. We can be making genuine savings from next year onwards. Laura Maersk isn't going to make much savings on her own. She's one ship, she's quite small, but she's a research and development ability for us to test how it works as we get the rest of the fleet lined up and ready. Ammonia is another potential fuel, but we see that the testing that's going on with engines just now and eventually getting into smaller ships later this decade won't really be sizable till probably, or scalable till probably the end of the 20s into the 30s. So we would have lost the whole 20s if we waited for green ammonia. So while methanol is absolutely what we're using for this decade, it doesn't mean to say it's going to be what's needed in the future. It might be green ammonia, we might move on to hydrogen, who knows what could come next. And unfortunately, from a port perspective, that's probably not what you want to hear. You want to hear this is the one fuel that we're going to use, nice and easy as it was with diesel. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. I mentioned Laura a couple of times. I just wanted to also make the point that when she was here, she'd come in from Rotterdam, she discharged containers and cargo at UK ports, which then transited through those terminals with electric terminal equipment onto a train powered by HVO, moved up to a free port under that HVO train, then was met by an electric Arctic, which brought it round to our warehouse in East Midlands, which is BREEAM Green Excellent Standard. So we actually have conducted end-to-end movements of green cargo arriving in the UK and being distributed out from a warehouse as well. So again, a few containers, a first step, but it really shows that it can be done, and we're not having to wait for decades to get that going. We now just need to scale up. And then the scaling up goes somewhat further forward. Once we get beyond 2030, once we need to create green fuel for all our fleet, we only need a little bit of electricity, like 200 terawatts. That would be equivalent to a solar field, which is 2,000 square kilometres, which obviously we're not going to be building in Orkney or for that matter in South Shields. But we will need a hell of a lot of electricity for our fleet. I'm talking on a global scale, obviously. For vessels on a more local basis, then they will have a variety of options for green fuels, but electricity is an absolute key to it. So again, we've heard a couple of speakers this morning talk about the regulatory push that is required, and we see some good things happening. Not just from the EU, but from UK government as well. Again, the UK shore has been mentioned this morning. Things like the Clean Maritime Demonstration, Maritime Accelerator are all really good initiatives to get the research and development going. But we are looking to see if we can push forward things like in the EU. In 2022, the ETS was delivered, which will start to level the playing field and bring others forward. We feel we're, in our field, somewhat out there alone. And with Fuel EU, those coming forward should be able to choose the right fuels for them and accelerate the transition. So pleased to see what EU have been doing, and we want to see that happening in more places around the world. We've also heard this morning about IMO and their increased ambition, finally, the milestones at 2030 and at 2040, and a pricing mechanism coming in 2025, which is really very keenly sought after as well. So we believe that a level regulatory playing field is key to achieving full decarbonisation. The EU and US will only address part of the problems, which we all are part of and which we all want to be involved in the resolution. But we really need all jurisdictions to be involved in that moving forward. And that's the Laura Maersk. So feel free to clap. And I got a bit panicked there on time because I thought the time was counting down, but it's not, it's an actual clock. So I've gone a bit fast, which means that if there are any questions, we should have more time for it. And I think there might be a roving microphone, is there?
Yes, there is. So we've got Reese and Jack. Questions for David, please. There's one over there, far table. Thank you.
Hi there. I had a quick question about the demand for green fuels and whether you had an opinion on whether the production of those green fuels would be centralised and then distributed, or whether there'd be small pockets of production at each port that you operate from.
I think there's two answers to that question. One would be from our perspective, and I think, again, because we pretty much have got a plan of where we're going to be and when, we'll continue to run the bunkering the way that we have done before. So we would eventually see that there will be a few bunkering stops on each voyage. We wouldn't necessarily be looking for it in every location. In saying that, the 16,000 TEU ships that are coming out from January all have built into them a fuel tank that's capable of doing a full single round trip. Because we understand that in the first few years there isn't going to be, even in the major ports, necessarily the quantity of fuel where we need it, when we need it. But that is the first part of the answer, which would be me speaking from a Maersk perspective on our fleet. I would imagine there'll be a slightly different answer, perhaps for vessels with other roles. And so there, I think we might see more requirement, and that would be linked to where electricity is available. And if you can't connect the electricity to the grid, then you maybe turn that electricity at source into something that's more easily transportable. And in fact, one of the cohorts of the Maritime Accelerator this time round has got a mobile pumping solution, which is a bunkering system that's palletized and can be taken along with a 20-foot ISO of fuel and can pretty much bunker anywhere. So some of those solutions are coming through for vessels that would need to bunker somewhere more unusual than they were otherwise anticipating.
Thank you. One more question for time, and then if you can come down to Chris, Jack, please. Thank you.
I wanted to know about green corridors and if Maersk is thinking about using them, and if you are, what's your business model for that? As in, do you require regulators to restrict only clean vessels using that route, or an incentive for clean, or a penalty for dirty, as it were?
Yeah, I think that yes, we are looking at green corridors. There has been a couple of Trans-Pacific corridors specifically looked at recently. I'm not sure where we're up to. I'm not involved in those projects specifically. I can probably dig a bit out. We would be looking probably initially from a mechanical perspective as to how do we actually do it. Is the infrastructure at both ends, can we make it work physically? Once we've proven that it can be done, then yes, I think we would be looking for some encouragement from the regulators to make sure that there was an even playing field, which could either be a cost of carbon or maybe a direction that clean shipping should be used. But while it's nice to say we want the regulators to be responsible for getting this done, there is also a role for the consumer of freight in this, and the decisions and the ultimate consumers of the goods that are being moved, to understand, in actual fact, we might have to pay 30 euro cents more on a hand of bananas, but it's coming to us in a green manner, rather than maybe getting it slightly cheaper, but we're ruining the planet as we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.